Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So I hope you had a good break. I know it was not necessarily spring break for all of us, but hopefully you at least had a break from your GBC classes. So we're getting back into the swing of things now. This is the beginning of week 9, and just to keep in mind, we have reached the halfway point of the semester. So we have completed 8 weeks. And we have 8 weeks left to go if you include our final week of the semester, which is exam week. We don't have class, but we're finishing everything up. So this is kind of a good time to take stock, maybe take a look at the grade book, see where you stand grade-wise. I mean, most of us are doing fine, but if you have any questions or concerns about assignments, or if you want a little extra help on our upcoming response paper, please get in touch. We can always talk more. And just remember, our second critical response is due at the end of this week because we are concluding our second unit this week. So I've broken the semester schedule up into 3 general units. I don't know if you guys have noticed that. That's really only reflected on the syllabus if you take a look at the course schedule. So part 1 was sort of like origins. Part 2 is all about change and the sort of growth of American independent film. And then we move into our third and final unit next week, which is the rise of Miramax. We've already talked about Miramax a little bit, both the good and the bad associated with that particular studio, which started life as an independent studio and then ultimately was bought by Disney and sort of became an arm of a much bigger sort of corporate entity. But a lot of the later movies that we watch are going to be Miramax films. So not every single film in Unit 3, but the majority. I think all but one of our final group of films are either produced and distributed by Miramax, or at least produced or distributed, one or the other, by Miramax. So we do start the third unit next week, so just keep that in mind. We always have a critical response due at the end of a unit. So yeah, get in touch if you have any questions or concerns, but otherwise we'll just keep chugging along as we continue to move through the early 90s. So we talked about Daughters of the Dust a couple of weeks ago before the break. That came out in 92, and now we've moved up to 1993, and that's where we find ourselves this week as we talk about Dazed and Confused, written and directed by Richard Linklater. So this is a film that most people are at least somewhat familiar with. It's obviously a popular film. It ended up being pretty commercially popular. I'll talk a little bit more about the production history. And I actually want you guys to read a chapter in Pearson's book. He doesn't talk about this film specifically. Instead, he's talking about Slacker, which was really Linklater's first film, his first theatrically released film, his first film that really sort of helped him break through and make an impact. We're not watching Slacker, but I still want you guys to read the chapter about it because a lot of what Pearson's talking about can be applied equally well to Dazed and Confused. So we'll talk a little bit more about the production and the fact that this movie did not do great at the box office. It did not really make a whole lot of money in theaters, even though it got a decent theatrical release. But it later found second life, and it really achieved cult status thanks to home video. So Pearson does mention that in the chapter about Slacker, and he's just making some larger observations about Linklater and his career and his style. So a lot of that is useful for us this week. So this is a movie, Dazed and Confused is sometimes described as a film that a lot of film buffs or film nerds really like. So if you've ever heard the expression, it's the kind of movie that people who really like movies like. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just kind of a movie often cherished and treasured by aficionados and, people who have sort of an extensive, film collection, or they just are big movie fans. But I think what's also interesting about the film is that even if we have not seen it, I've often talked to people, friends of mine or colleagues, people who have not seen the film, but when I mention the title, it almost always rings a bell. I mean, of course, this is also the title of a pretty famous Led Zeppelin song, so that might be how some of us are familiar with it. But this is the kind of film that even if you haven't seen it, you're probably at least somewhat aware of it. You're probably at least somewhat aware of what it's about. You have some idea about the film, even if you haven't actually sat down and watched it. And as we continue to progress through the 90s, and as we notice these indie films getting increasingly sort of glossy, expensive and well received, and sort of commercially successful as well, we're going to notice that a lot of the films we watch perhaps in the second half of the class really sort of fit that definition. Maybe we haven't seen them, but we've heard of them. Maybe we don't know a whole lot about them, but we have a general idea of what they're about, and we're sort of aware that they had some kind of a significant cultural impact. So even if you haven't seen Dazed and Confused, you've heard the title, you probably know it's about like teenagers in the 70s doing a lot of drugs and getting into trouble. Perhaps you've seen the famous cover, like the movie poster that later showed up on a lot of VHS, covers. It was often seen in video stores and posters and clothing of like the three sort of hippie kids. I think it's Mila Jovovich, maybe Wiley Wiggins, who I can't remember exactly who's on the cover. It might have been Wiley Wiggins, Mila Jovovich, and I think one other cast member. Maybe it was Jason London. But they're sort of wearing typical, sort of hippie garb. Somebody's flashing a peace sign. It was kind of an iconic video cover. You saw it a lot. Even if you never actually saw the film. I can remember going to Blockbuster a lot as a kid. I can definitely relate to the home video angle. And long before I ever saw the film, because I wasn't allowed to watch it as a kid because of all the drug use and stuff, long before I had ever seen it, I recognized the cover. And the cover has a lot of really important sort of signifiers, like a lot of important sort of cultural signifiers with the clothes and the font of the letters, and even something like the peace sign. The kids appear to be on drugs. There's a lot of obvious sort of cultural signifiers that put us in mind of the 70s, put us in mind of sort of hippies and sort of all that entails, rock music, recreational drug use. There's a lot of work being done even in a simple image like that. But again, it kind of gives us a pretty general impression of what this movie is sort of all about and the kind of, sort of cultural touchstones that it's including. So, it's sort of permeated our pop culture. I would say a lot of people are familiar with it. And even, again, if we haven't seen the movie, we at least sort of know what it is. So that's always an interesting phenomenon to include. And sometimes when we actually sit down, or an interesting phenomenon to study, or sort of to track. And sometimes when we sit down and actually watch the film, it might be a little bit different than our preconceived notion, but at least we have an idea of sort of the role the film plays in our larger culture. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. And it's also a question that I posed on this week's discussion board, because again, this film was often viewed, at least in the 90s, and I would argue still today to a certain extent, is sort of thought of as a cult classic. And we can talk about what that means. Again, that has a lot to do with home video. And the success it found on home video, but also it's often just kind of regarded as like a cool, fun movie. It has a lot of comedic elements, but especially as I was coming of age in the 90s, I didn't see it until college, but again, I knew what it was. My sister, who was older, she really liked it. I could hear her and her friends talking about it, and it did something of real value when it came out. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, because we can kind of get into some interesting stuff about generational change and how teen culture, youth culture has kind of changed over time as well. But also, I think the film plays a little bit differently now, almost exactly 30 years after its release. I think it plays differently now than it did back in the early 90s. So I would like to discuss that a little bit as well. But let's start with Linklater. We can talk a little bit about him. He's a very interesting filmmaker, I think. Again, he represents a trend that we've noticed a lot in this class. Indie filmmakers who make it, they hit it big with a successful film, and then that earns them a chance to make bigger budget movies, often from major Hollywood studios. That has very much been the case for Linklater, but like a lot of these filmmakers also, he has kind of a distinctive style that he's often associated with, and we can see a lot of the a lot of characteristics of that style on display in this film. So he's an Austin, Texas-based filmmaker. He is a native Texan. So he's always kind of existed a little bit outside of that traditional Hollywood infrastructure. Although, again, as we're going to notice, and you guys might already know this, he's gone on to become a pretty mainstream commercial filmmaker, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't mean to make that sound like an insult, but he's done that while also retaining certain aspects of that signature style that he really cultivated early in his career when he was still viewed as an indie filmmaker. So again, you can learn a little bit more about his backstory and his career if you read that chapter on Slacker from Pearson. But his first film was actually called It's Impossible to Learn to Plow by Reading Books, which he did in the late 80s, like 88 or 89. He produced the film, he got the film made, but it was never actually distributed. It might have played at a few small film festivals, but it never got a theatrical release. It never had a wide distribution. So very few people ever saw it. Kind of underscores the importance of people like Pearson. Like Linklater wasn't able to get a distribution deal for that first film. And as we've seen, that's largely what Pearson did throughout the 80s and early 90s. He helped a lot of independent filmmakers get those distribution deals, often with pretty big distribution companies who might have been affiliated with bigger studios, or in some cases, indie distribution companies that would later get bought up by the big studios. So that's kind of what Pearson does. But anyway, that was Linklater's first film, and then in 1990 he does Slacker, and that Slacker does actually get purchased and distributed. It gets a national release, I think, in 91. I think the film first came out in 90, but doesn't actually get distributed until 91. And it didn't make a ton of money, but it sort of established Linklater as an exciting young talent. And a lot of the subject matter, a lot of the stylistic elements that Linklater would later become known for were obviously on display in Slacker. And something that Pearson talks about, and I think it's really interesting, we have to get into sort of a larger conversation about generations, a little bit of social science, but Pearson talks about how Linklater, largely on the strength of Slacker, and then Dazed and Confused, which comes out just a couple of years later, he starts to get sort of associated with Generation X, which you guys might be familiar with as sort of like a cohort or like a group of people. If you guys ever look at like the different generations and how they get organized, that's largely social science. Like, I'm no expert, but it's usually based on when you were born. Right? So Generation X is usually thought of as just a very large group consisting of people born roughly between like 1965 and like 1980. Maybe a little bit of a larger time frame than that, but roughly like mid-60s to about the early 80s. And Linklater was often viewed as kind of making movies for Gen X. Like, he was making movies he was first sort of, establishing himself as a major voice right as a lot of Gen X people were kind of coming of age. And again, I sort of use my sister as an example. She's older than me, so she was born in 76. I'm a millennial. I was born in 84. So we're kind of on, different sides of that generational divide. But, she was a big fan of this movie, saw it either at the end of high school or the beginning of college, I'm not sure, but, she was like 17, when this film came out. Very much the same age as a lot of the characters in the film. So, not only through this film, but also subsequent work that Linklater did, he was often thought of as kind of speaking not only to Generation X, but also kind of speaking for them, kind of expressing a lot of their sentiments, a lot of their sort of disillusionment, their boredom with sort of late 20th century American life, often a kind of suburban existence. We're going to see some evidence of that in this film. And again, these are just sort of terms or ideas that often got associated with Linklater. He was often thought of as kind of giving voice to like middle class, disaffected, alienated suburban kids. And maybe we don't typically feel all that bad for kids like that. But again, they were growing up, kind of coming of age in the 80s and 90s. And there were just certain traits. A lot of it was, sort of stereotypical or very generalized, but there were certain traits that were often attributed to Gen X. They were often thought of as, kind of lazy or again, just sort of disaffected, not really excited about, entering the workforce and having a life that sort of looks like their parents. So again, it kind of helps to know a little bit more about generational divides. So, you guys probably know that baby boomers come before Gen X. And that's kind of a point that Pearson makes, is that really Linklater is kind of too old to be a Gen Xer. He's born in 62, which technically qualifies him as a very young boomer. So you guys probably know, baby boomers came along right after World War II, right? There's a huge population boom starting in the late 40s after the war ends, and then all the way through the 50s, continuing on into the early 60s. Huge population boom as a lot of soldiers are returning home, starting families. You guys have learned this before, I'm sure. It's also a huge boom in suburban growth. There's a lot of new suburban communities being built, often outside of major cities or large towns. And again, there had been suburbs before, but this was a huge building boom and a huge population boom, and it sort of coincides with an era that was often thought of as kind of economically prosperous. Again, if you read enough historians and social scientists, you'll of course learn that all of this opportunity and prosperity, it wasn't being shared. It wasn't really equally enjoyed. It was mostly there for white, heterosexual, Protestant people, certainly white people first and foremost. But yeah, it was sort of a boom time. That's kind of how we think of the boomers, right? And so my parents are baby boomers. I'm assuming a lot of you are younger than me, so maybe your grandparents, if you're roughly my age, yeah, probably your parents are boomers. Both of my parents were born in the 50s. So they're growing up in kind of this time of economic prosperity, a lot of opportunity, excitement. Okay, great. Of course, that's simplified, but that's often how we remember it. And then once, the boomer era is over, Gen X kicks in, like I said, starting around the mid-60s, people born in the mid to late 60s, all the way through the 70s. They belong to Generation X. So even though Linklater might have been sort of speaking the language of Gen X, and he's often depicting certain themes and things that would have been relevant to Gen X, he himself isn't necessarily a member of that generation. And that's kind of important to remember in relation to this film, because of course we're back in the 70s now. So the characters in this film are closer to Linklater in terms of their age and generation. So these kids really are boomers, right? I mean, we're in the mid-70s in this film. I believe Pearson argues that the Wiley Wiggins character, Mitch, who's like a freshman, right, a ninth grader, he's roughly the same age at this point in time that Linklater would have really been. So if this is 76, that's when Linklater would have been 14, and that's how old Mitch is. So again, these are kids that were, if they're all like, in high school by the mid 70s, that means they were born in the late 50s or the early 60s. So they're roughly the same age as Linklater, which means they actually belong to that earlier generation. But Linklater would later go on to make some films that are a lot more specifically about kind of a Gen X experience. So in 96, for example, he comes out with a movie called Suburbia, which is very much about suburban living. And, again, these are like middle-class kids, but they feel very like disconnected from their families and from society, and they like alternative music and nobody understands them, right? These are a lot of tropes that, we're pretty familiar with because every generation feels in some of those ways. But again, this was a lot of important sort of subject matter for a lot of audiences in the 90s because that's really when a lot of Gen Xers were, finishing high school or college and sort of becoming young adults and trying to find their way in the world. So like films like Reality Bites, which came out in 94 with Winona Ryder and Ethan Hawke, another sort of film that often gets associated with Gen X, this film as well. I mentioned a little bit of this when we were talking about My Own Private Idaho. I mentioned like grunge music and sort of that whole grunge like visual aesthetic that still exists. I mean, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. The music was a very specific kind of like subgenre of rock music that became very popular in the 90s that largely came out of the Pacific Northwest. We associate it often with bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and some of that stuff is still around. I mean, Pearl Jam's still around. I mean, we still hear that sort of style of music, even though it's probably gotten blended with other things. And also like flannel, ripped jeans. We see a little bit of those stylistic signifiers in My Own Private Idaho, just in part because of the fact that we're in the Pacific Northwest and we're kind of in the right time period. But Gus Van Sant doesn't really explore it in all that much detail. He does in other films. He actually, Van Sant does a film about Kurt Cobain, kind of a dramatized reenactment of the last few days of Cobain's life. So, I mean, Van Sant was kind of interested in the grunge subculture as well, but he's just not really exploring it that much in My Own Private Idaho. So we've already seen maybe a little bit of it. You guys are probably familiar with it just again because it's one of those trends or sort of subcultures that became quite popular for a while and aspects of it still remain. So anyway, after Gen X, we have millennials. That's, my generation, people who were born, between like the early 80s and maybe like the mid 90s. And then after that, I always get it mixed up. It's either Generation Y or Generation Z, and they're a whole different breed. I can't speak for them. But it is kind of important to think a little bit about sort of Generation X and what it meant to people, like what people thought about that generation in the 90s, how it got talked about, how it got written about. And again, Linklater is sort of thought of as a bit of a spokesman for an entire generation. Again, that gets a little complicated, and Pearson complicates it in the chapter about Slacker because he's saying, we often want to categorize Linklater with like, filmmakers like Kevin Smith and Quentin Tarantino, who we're going to watch later. And really, he owes more to an older generation of filmmakers like Jarmusch, who were sort of raised more on art films and international, European films, avant-garde stuff. So one thing you guys have probably noticed, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but it is kind of an important distinction that Pearson makes. You probably noticed it between what he calls art film brats and like multi-brats or multiplex brats. I can't remember the exact terminology, but he uses these terms. They might seem kind of meaningless, but they are sort of speaking to an important, I guess, like, again, kind of a generational shift. He's making the argument that people like him, Pearson, and like Jarmusch, they came of age going to independent theaters like in Manhattan, watching art house cinema from other countries or watching really avant-garde stuff that was really kind of underground. And he makes a distinction between people like that versus people like Smith and Tarantino, a later generation of filmmakers. Those guys were Gen Xers. A later generation of filmmakers who came up in a different era. And also it was based on geography, right? Like Kevin Smith's from suburban New Jersey. Tarantino's from suburban Southern California. They weren't growing up in places that had a ton of independent repertory theaters where you could see art films and famous movies from France and Italy, famous art films from France and Italy that were very influential to a lot of American filmmakers, but it was harder to get your hands on those kind of movies in a lot of suburban places. So according to Pearson and others, Smith and Tarantino are more sort of products of the multiplex, the movie theaters that you find in malls with multiple screens, where you're mostly going to watch big budget Hollywood studio movies. Or in the case of Tarantino, he used to work at a video store, so he was watching a lot of movies on home video. So they were watching different kinds of movies. They had different kinds of sensibilities. But again, a lot of those distinctions are a little flimsy. I mean, we know that Smith was influenced by Jarmusch. I mean, he talks about it in the book. So we don't want to be too rigid with these categorizations, but I think Pearson's really just pointing to a generational shift, right? Because a lot of those indie art theaters went under. They were often replaced by multiplexes in much of the country. So it's really kind of an older generation that came of age more like in the 70s or early 80s, like Pearson and Jarmusch. That was more their experience. Whereas people like Smith and Tarantino, who grew up a little bit later, maybe later on into the 80s, were kind of coming of age, more like typical Gen Xers in the 80s and early 90s. They were watching films in a different way, because, maybe not as exposed to the art stuff maybe until film school, or they had to work a little harder to watch those movies. But again, Pearson's making the point that Linklater actually has more in common with a filmmaker like Jarmusch in terms of his influences, the big European influence, very interested in continental philosophy, a lot of academic stuff that might not always show up in the work of someone like Smith or Tarantino. So it's interesting to think about how we categorize Linklater. Because again, he is often lumped in with sort of younger filmmakers. He's often thought of as a voice for Generation X. But he's a little more complicated than that. And I would argue that he's kind of become a gun for hire now. Like as he crossed over and had more commercial success, he increasingly just sort of made, big budget movies that aren't specific to any particular generation or milieu. So I just wanted to mention a few of his other films, a few of his other big ones. Waking Life, which is actually animated, that came out in '98, was pretty popular. Many of you might know him best through his film School of Rock, which came out in 2003 with Jack Black. That's a pretty fun comedy. A lot of his movies are classified as comedies, Dazed and Confused included. He also did Bernie in 2011. That's a little scene film, but really good, funny, has Matthew McConaughey in it. Again, set in East Texas, similar to where we are in this film. Some of you might have seen Boyhood, which came out in 2014. I would recommend that if you have some time on your hands. It's a really interesting film. The way he did it was interesting. He actually filmed it over a long period of time, sort of following his two leads from the time that they were children, like small children, all the way up to like teen years. So it takes them like a decade to gather all the footage. And then, of course, they later edit it, put it together. And that came out in 2014, was nominated for some awards, got a lot of critical attention. Don't know if it made a ton of money. It's kind of it's a bit of an investment. It's a long film, but it really is good, worth watching. More recently, he did a film in 2016 called Everybody Wants Some, which is about college baseball players. It's often thought of as kind of it's been called a spiritual sequel to Dazed and Confused. I don't know if I quite read it that way, but it's definitely tapping into some of the same spirit in terms of like the music, teen culture, dropping us in the middle of a very large cast, and most of the characters just sit around and talk. and, get intoxicated. So it is similar in that regard. So maybe you've seen some of his other films. He's also known for what's called the Before trilogy. This is 3 films that all have the word before in the title. So we have Before Sunrise, I think that came out in 95, Before Sunset, which was the sequel, and then Before Midnight, which I think came out in 2013. All of those star Ethan Hawke and the French actress Julie Delpy. It's, romance. Hawke's an American traveling in Europe, and he meets her in the first one, and then they have this sort of tumultuous, long-standing relationship. Again, a lot of talking, dialogue heavy. Linklater has always been known for that, but they're also thought of as sort of, really well done sort of romances with some comedic elements still included. So he's known for those. He had a lot of success through those. He also did Bad News Bears in 2005, which I have not seen. That's, of course, a remake of a 1970s film with Walter Matthau. I don't know if that one's any good. I did not catch it. But like I said, he's really become a pretty commercial filmmaker with stuff like School of Rock and the Bad News Bears. But with the Before trilogy, and certainly with these early films, we see a lot of defining traits that people have written about in relation to him. So again, a lot of talking. We need to, throw that out there to start. The characters talk a lot. So a real emphasis on dialogue, often very large casts. I believe Pearson does some math and tells us that there are 78 different characters in this film. He mentions that near the end of the Slacker chapter. He does actually talk a little bit about Dazed and Confused at the end of the chapter. So very large cast, a lot of characters, a lot of minor characters that we don't necessarily get to know all that well, but we hear a lot of dialogue. These are very talkative characters, and it often feels like we're just sort of moving from one conversation to another. We're listening to one group of people talk, and then we might shift our perspective, and we're listening to a different group talk or a different pair, and often the characters aren't doing much more than just talking. Maybe drinking and smoking marijuana. Those are also common activities in this film, but frequently they're just sitting around talking, and that's also true of Slacker and a lot of Linklater's other early work. It's also true in Everybody Wants Some, that 2016 film that I mentioned. So it can often feel a little bit aimless, a little bit random. Some people call it sort of a shaggy approach, like not very plot driven. Although there is a plot, things happen, nothing really earth-shattering. But again, this film in particular has often been considered really adept at sort of just capturing sort of what teen life feels like. Capturing the sort of mundane, everyday details, acquiring beer, having a crush, going to a party. In the grand scheme of things, these aren't, these don't have super high levels of importance, but they seem very important. When you're 16 or, 14, 16, 17, these sorts of things feel very important. So we do sort of exist on this mundane, everyday level, but that's how that's the level that a lot of kids are sort of operating on. A lot of kids and teenagers, their lives largely do revolve around, social activities, relationships, sports, academics, and that ever-present question, certainly for high schoolers, what's next? What are you going to do after graduation? What kind of life do you want? Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? So these are universal things. Obviously, there's a lot in this film that's sort of unique to 70s teen culture, because again, that's where we are, right? We're going back in time, roughly 20 years prior to when the film was made. We're going back to a previous era, a previous generation. We're kind of reveling in the nostalgia of, for the 70s, the clothes, the music, the cars, but at the same time, these are many universal themes that, everybody can relate to regardless of their age. But I actually wanted to read this this brief passage from the chapter called Slacking Off, because again, we can apply this to Dazed and Confused as well. Pearson's talking about the structure and how it often seems aimless, but there's more to it. So this is the final paragraph on page 187 of the chapter Slacking Off. Slacker instantly felt like an engaging 24-hour tour across the four corners of a hanging out college town. So it's set in Austin, Texas, whereas that's where Linklater actually lives. We have an amusing collection of about 100 losers and schmoozers, conspiracy buffs, angry romantics, vanishing poets, and wacky philosophers. But here's the important part. As day turned to night in the film, it might have gotten a little tedious. This is how some of us might feel as viewers. I might have even shifted into my own dream state, says Pearson. So I watched again the next day. Suddenly, I became acutely aware of the absolute brilliance of the structure. The deft filmmaking touch illustrated by the clever links between the 36 different episodes demanded respect. And then he goes on to talk about the actual budget of the film and the fact that it looks pretty good. It was not made on the cheap like a lot of the other films we've seen so far. And not to say that those earlier films didn't look good in their own way, but this film doesn't really feel as much like an independent film, right? Based on the budget, based on certain visual choices. We have a big cast, technically it seems pretty sophisticated. And that's kind of important to keep in mind as well. We're going to notice that more and more as we move through the 90s with the films that we're watching. But I want to go back to that idea of structure and how it might feel a little tedious or aimless as we wander from one conversation to the next. But again, he's talking about Slacker, but we can apply this to Dazed and Confused. There are a lot of connections between all of the different characters, between all of the different episodes. It's a very episodic structure, right? As we go from sort of group to group, place to place, but they're all tied together. There's a lot of larger unity at work. You kind of have to look for it at times, but like he says, it kind of demands a closer look. And I think that is true of a lot of Linklater's films. They actually are very tightly structured in a way. They seem loose. They seem very casual. But there's actually a very clear structure at work, and everything is deliberate. All of the choices, all of the transitions between from episode to episode, conversation to conversation, all of it means something. All of it is sort of significant. So again, this is one way that I think we can kind of compare Linklater to Jarmusch. Their films feel very different, but we kind of talked about this a little bit with Jarmusch, how when you first watch Stranger Than Paradise, you might be tempted to say, there's not really a plot, like very little happens, but there is a plot. And actually, there's a really clear 3-part structure at work in the film. That's a very traditional, almost like classical structure that we can, trace back to ancient Greek drama. I mean, that's a really traditional way to organize a narrative into 3 acts. And that's what Jarmusch does. And then we notice that Tom DeSillo's cinematography is actually pretty polished. Even though the shots are long, we don't have a lot of camera movement. DeSillo's an expert at framing and sort of capturing memorable images. And when he does move the camera, that always has significance as well. So when you look more closely, there's more to it than what you might see initially. And I think that's also the case with Dazed and Confused when it comes to structure. Again, we can see right away. The camera moves. It doesn't feel like it was made for super cheap. And it wasn't. I mean, the budget was almost $7 million, $6.9 million. To make the movie, and it kind of shows, right? I mean, we have a lot more setups. We don't just have one camera, one sound guy, the one guy with the boom mic. We even talked about this a little bit with Roger and Me, how the cheapness of the film, the lack of a big budget, actually has a lot of far-reaching consequences that are kind of interesting to track, right? With Michael Moore, we talked about how his cheap budget would not allow him to film two different things that were happening in two different places at the same time. So that means he plays a little fast and loose with chronology, because when he wants to create that dramatic juxtaposition at the end, he has to pretend like two things are happening simultaneously, when in fact he filmed them separately, because as Roger Ebert told us, he only had one camera. It was a one camera setup, right? He only had, a small skeleton crew. They didn't have a lot of money. Now, again, we decided for the most part on the discussion board that we didn't really care that Moore had to play fast and loose with the chronology. But again, that was a stylistic choice largely motivated by a lack of money and the fact that they didn't have the resources to film multiple things at the same time. So, it's not that those movies weren't professionally done, but they were just cheap. And when they're cheap, that has impact, right? That impacts other aspects of the film. So we could see that maybe in Parting Glances. We could definitely see that in Stranger Than Paradise. We could see that in Roger and Me, but we're going to see it less and less as we progress. And we don't see a lot of budget-based limitations here. I mean, we don't have a lot of explosions or special effects, but it doesn't really seem like Linklater has to skimp on anything because he's working with a pretty big budget. So that's something we can also observe. But in terms of his writing, because remember, he's a writer and a director here, his writing, much like Jarmusch's, there's a lot more than initially meets the eye. But they're both, again, sort of similar in the fact that they make comedies that aren't always filled with like tons of laugh out loud moments. They can be kind of subtle in their comedy. Sometimes it can be more sort of observational humor that just maybe elicits a chuckle, not, uproarious laughter. But yeah, I would encourage you guys to compare him a little bit to Jarmusch. There's more similarity between the two of them than you might initially think. Of course, I've just kind of explained it all, but you can maybe find more. All right, so I want to get back to Linklater just a little bit because I want to talk about the suburbs, and then I want to talk about coolness before we get into the film and some more specifics. So I won't really talk about the film itself in a ton of detail, just because, I don't need to break down the plot for you guys, and I'm already providing a lot of the context that we need. So we'll get to the film towards the end, but I want to return to Linklater in his own bio, just because it's interesting to consider. He's obviously drawing on some autobiographical elements here, and Pearson mentions that. So near the end of Slacking Off, he talks about how Linklater is how Linklater's drawing on, his own background as like an athlete when it comes to Pink and that whole character arc. But then also Mitch is kind of a stand-in for Linklater based on that age connection that I've already mentioned. Mitch is the same age in the film that Linklater would have been in 1976. So we'll come back to that, but I just wanted to talk about where Linklater grew up. It's in East Texas. It's a city, kind of a small city, I guess we would say, or maybe a big town. I'm not exactly sure how we designate it, but he grew up in Huntsville, Texas, which is in the eastern part of the state. It's got about 45,000 people, so it's not a tiny place, but it's also not a major city. It's also a college town. It's the home of Sam Houston State, which is kind of a mid-sized regional public university in Texas, part of the larger public Texas college system, which is a very large system, as you guys can imagine. Texas is a very big state. I think at least one of us in the class lives in Texas, if I recall. I'm not an expert on Texas, certainly. I've traveled there. I have some friends who live there. But I want us to think a little bit about Huntsville, Texas, just for a moment. It is a college town. In fact, Linklater's, I always get this confused. It's either his mom or his dad. I think it was his mom was a college professor at Sam Houston State. And Linklater later attended that school and played baseball there before dropping out, kind of wandering around and eventually becoming a filmmaker. But I want to think about Huntsville and the kind of place it is. Because again, we've heard that Linklater sort of represents this suburban perspective that was very characteristic of Generation X, because a lot of white Gen X kids grew up in the suburbs. So I know not all of us share that kind of a background, but it is kind of important to just think about how many Americans do. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I would hazard a guess that more Americans live in sort of suburban communities or places like Huntsville, like small cities or kind of big towns or suburban communities located outside of cities. I would argue more Americans live in places like those than do in, like, really rural places, and maybe even more than big cities, although my math might not be very good there. But the point is, a lot of people live in places like Huntsville, Texas. They often get overlooked in pop culture, though, right? Small town or like big town. Like, and this isn't exactly small town life. 45,000 people. That's a decent sized place. There's a college there, there's going to be an entertainment district, restaurants, bars, probably a few different, schools, different high schools, decent sized population, but it's not Houston. It's not Dallas, right? So it's not a major city, but it's also not a farm. It's not a small town. And if you guys notice, in our culture, in our pop culture, a lot of our fiction, we either find ourselves in like big, bustling urban environments like New York or LA or Houston, which is like the fourth biggest city, not far from Huntsville, like the fourth biggest city in America. We're either in like a big city or we're in a small town, right? Or we're in some kind of really rural atmosphere. And we don't always get a lot of portrayals of that in between. I mean, certainly there are some, and Linklater does it a lot. But that sort of middle America, or that sort of like middle class suburban existence, it's become kind of a trope. It's familiar even to people who don't live like that, because it is representative of a lot of people's experience, but it's often sort of thought of as maybe a little dull, and that might be why it doesn't get depicted on screen quite as much as maybe rural life or urban life, which can sometimes maybe be perceived as a little more interesting. But there are some things to note here about a place like Huntsville. So yeah, we're in Texas, and maybe some of you picked up on that over the course of the film. We're in East Texas, though. And of course, we know that Texas is a very large state. And I think I kind of mentioned this a little bit with the Thin Blue Line. And some of you probably know more about this than me, but East Texas is often sort of culturally related to the South, like the Southeast, or at least it's thought of that way. Because East Texas, of course, if you go far enough east, you're bordering Louisiana, Arkansas, and those are southern states. So like culturally, in terms of like music, fashion, even accents, the way people talk, there's a lot of commonality between East Texas and Arkansas, Louisiana. But then, of course, if you go further west, if you end up in West Texas, that's more like the far west. That's more like cowboys, the frontier, very different, sort of culturally different in terms of, again, accents, clothes, other sort of cultural signifiers. So, we're in East Texas here, which does kind of matter, although the thing about suburbs and towns like Huntsville is you can often pick them up and put them almost anywhere in America, right? I mean, there are certain things here that might remind us of Texas, like the emphasis on football, or we do hear some southern accents, but it's important to note that not all of our characters speak with southern accents. Like we have Wooderson, portrayed by Matthew McConaughey. He definitely sounds like he's from East Texas, and McConaughey is, in fact, from Texas. But, other characters could be conceivably from anywhere. And that's often described as a key trait of the suburbs, right? They don't have a lot of distinctive qualities always. They could kind of exist anywhere. You could pick up a lot of these communities, put them in other parts of the country, and they wouldn't really be all that different. So we can see how that leads to a certain disillusioned or sort of disaffected perspective, especially for kids, for young people. They often feel bored. There's not a whole lot to do. You kind of feel stifled. Again, it's not a tiny place, but it's small enough to where a lot of people know each other, people know your parents. So kids would often feel kind of trapped. It was sort of viewed as sort of a stultifying environment where maybe there wasn't always an emphasis on art and creativity, but more so maybe like conformity, go to college, get a good job, live a life just like your parents. So we see with the characters here, particularly Pink, but others too, they're rebelling, right? They are rebelling against the sort of conventional markers of success that exist in this town and exist in their culture. So for Pink, that means kind of rejecting the jock life. And again, this is one of the reasons we can see some links to, some links to Linklater himself. So I just want to be a little clear here. I think I was speaking a little bit unclearly. Linklater himself is from Huntsville. So I don't know that the film necessarily takes place in Huntsville. We're never told exactly where we are. I'm just assuming that, and other critics also assume that Linklater was using his own hometown as the basis for the town that we are in the movie. But I want to be clear. We don't know that we are in Huntsville. That's just where, that's the basis. That's that's the kind of place that we're in. Roughly the same size, same kind of suburban feel. Again, it's not small town life. It's not super rural. We even hear some characters, I think, talk about going to Houston to buy Aerosmith tickets. So you're kind of close to big cities, but you're not in a big city. It's a very particular milieu that he's tapping into. But again, we can kind of see how a place like that, with the sort of conformity that's often, maybe a byproduct of a place like that, we can see how that would be maybe boring or sort of stultifying for a lot of young people, who want to be different or want to experience different things, and Pink feels sort of trapped by the expectations placed on him, as a star football player. And Linklater himself was an athlete, maybe not as big of a star as Pink is in the movie, but Linklater played football and baseball in high school. And like I mentioned, he went on to be a college baseball player as well. So when Everybody Wants Some, that 2016 film that's called the spiritual sequel to this film, he's drawing on a lot of his college experiences of playing baseball at Sam Houston State. And apparently they spent most of their time partying and having a lot of fun. So again, maybe shades of Linklater are present in Pink. Liking sports, liking his teammates, but wanting the ability to express himself and be an individual. And, to a certain extent, sports might be an obstacle to that. You have to be a team player. And in his case, he has to sign that, pledge that he will not, drink or, smoke pot. And obviously he wants to do both of those things. But he also wants to, hang out with his burnout friends and kind of just be free and be a kid. And sports, puts pressure on kids, certainly high-level high school athletics. So Linklater could draw on some of his own experiences there when he's writing the character of Pink. And this is that sort of vibe of rebellion in general that we get here. Again, that's largely a byproduct of the time period, right? We're back in the 70s. We know there was a lot of social change over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, but it wasn't just African Americans advocating for more, equality and rights. A lot of different minority groups were going through similar struggles, similar movements for women's rights, Native American rights, Hispanic rights, LGBTQ rights. All of that was going on throughout the 60s and 70s. So it was a time of a lot of change, a lot of upheaval. We all know that. But again, that's very much part of the atmosphere here. It's a lot of rebellion. Even though we've kind of missed Vietnam, we're a little bit past a lot of that initial social revolution, but a lot of these kids are still kind of invested in this idea of breaking free from what society wants, not conforming, not being like your parents. And again, that's a pretty easy thing to relate to, even if we come from a different generation. But just to kind of go back to when the film actually comes out, in the 90s, there was sort of a 1970s revival. And, we know this happens all the time. Culture is very cyclical, but throughout the 90s, there was sort of a return of a lot of like 70s fashion. A lot of people started wearing like bell-bottom jeans and tie-dye t-shirts again. And, this movie was a part of that larger kind of nostalgic trend. It's hard to say if the film started it. I would say it just kind of accelerated it. But, I started high school in 98, about 5 years after this film came out. And I can remember during my own high school days, there was a lot of like 70s fashion. And even a lot of the classic rock that we hear on the soundtrack was sort of getting popular again during that period. I don't think that's really still going on. I could be wrong. I don't know. It seems like we're busy now rehabilitating 90s culture, which is strange to observe. But, this happens a lot. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. During the 90s, a lot of people were trying to bring back certain aspects of 70s culture. So in the 90s, you have Gen Xers kind of almost getting nostalgic or hearkening back to an earlier generation. Again, the kids in the 70s would grow up to be boomers, would grow up to have kids who were Gen Xers, right? But kind of a certain maybe nostalgia for the rebellion, for the revolution, the fact that big change was happening, because in the 90s, didn't really feel like there was a lot of social revolution. It didn't really feel like there was a whole lot of change. You guys might have heard that era, like the very end of the 20th century, the 90s in particular, described as like the end of history. Not because it really was, but because that's how people kind of thought at the time. We thought that we had kind of finished all the big wars and all the big movements and all the big sort of social justice things. We thought all of that was done. And again, we were obviously very wrong about that. And this was largely white people, who thought that. But again, for Gen X kids coming of age in the 90s, they felt kind of adrift because there wasn't a war to protest. There wasn't really a cause like civil rights that you could align yourself with. I mean, there were causes, certainly social causes, there always are. But a lot of kids, and just again, speaking a little bit from my own experience, I'm not Gen X, but I came along shortly thereafter. It just felt like there wasn't as much to do. Like there just wasn't as many significant things going on. Everything felt more peaceful and quiet, but that was also kind of boring. So again, a lot of Gen X kids were bored. They felt like they didn't have a lot of outlets, for their creativity, their views, their individuality. So we kind of look back to that older generation and said, oh, well, they really had more fun back in the 70s and they had righteous causes and they were discovering things that are kind of old hat now, and it's nostalgia. We always get nostalgic, even if we didn't experience it ourselves. We often get nostalgic for previous eras, previous times. That's just a common thing that we see throughout history. But yeah, we're definitely hearkening back and maybe even romanticizing an earlier era. And just one other, sort of parallel to think about with Linklater before we actually get into the film is just the idea, and even Pearson uses this phrase, like, does Linklater help create like the teen comedy as we know it now? That's interesting to consider as well. Some critics and scholars will argue that Linklater, again, there were already teen comedies before Linklater came along. Of course, John Hughes in the 80s with stuff like Pretty in Pink and 16 Candles. But, if you watch those movies now, they seem a bit dated, perhaps. A lot of people think Linklater was helping to create some templates that would later show up really in the late 90s and the 2000s for kind of a new generation of teen comedies, where we often had very articulate, kind of neurotic teen characters, a lot like the ones we see here. They're very talkative, much like the ones we see here. So some comparisons have been made with shows like Dawson's Creek or Gossip Girl, and then the proliferation of late 90s teen comedies. Some of you may have seen some of these, like She's All That, Can't Hardly Wait, 10 Things I Hate About You. And all of these have similar characters and some similar scenes to what we find in Dazed and Confused. Of course, they're depicting a different kind of teen culture. They're not going back to the 70s. They're more contemporary. But again, the characterization is similar. These are characters who know a lot, they've read a lot, they're very self-aware, but they're also going through a lot of typical teen angst that's always, relatable. So that's another interesting thing to consider. But now I want to think about, again, just sort of like the perception of the film, the way it's often thought of or described as being cool. Like, what does it mean for the movie to be cool? Do we think the movie is cool? And do we think that the characters in the movie are cool? And if we do, what does that mean? So, of course, cool is a notoriously difficult sort of word to pin down. It changes over time. Different people like different things. They have different conceptions of what coolness actually consists of. But again, this film is often thought of as fun, amusing, and just sort of cool, both in terms of like the time period that it's capturing, but also just in terms of its own style and its own sense of humor. But I wanted us to kind of interrogate that idea a little bit and just sort of think about what it means. Like, how does like coolness manifest in the film? And why might people have found the film to be cool? Again, a lot of it might have to do with the cast. We see some members of the cast who would later go on to become huge stars, like Matthew McConaughey or Ben Affleck, but they play pretty small roles. Most of the major roles were played by actors who did not go on to be big stars, but you probably recognize a lot of them, especially if you watch other indie films. A lot of the cast members would go on to become pretty recognizable character actors. So Joey Lauren Adams, who plays Simone, Adam Goldberg, Mila Jovovich, who I've already mentioned. She kind of gets famous later from the Resident Evil movies, which she was a part of, but I wouldn't really say she's super famous. Cole Hauser, we're going to see him again later in Good Will Hunting, and especially Parker Posey. Who plays Darla, one of the mean seniors who's like hazing, the freshmen. Parker Posey was in a bunch of indie films, several other films made by Linklater, including Suburbia, which I mentioned before. And she actually got sort of some recognition for being sort of considered like an indie film darling. Like, she was in so many indie films. She kind of got famous that way. But still, mostly a character actor, not always the lead. And she is in some big budget movies as well. So we recognize a lot of the actors, that's part of it. The soundtrack might be part of the coolness. But if we actually look at the subject matter of the film, particularly the hazing stuff, that's what I mean when I said earlier that the film might play a little bit differently now than it did 30 years ago. Because a lot of the hazing stuff that we see, particularly early in the film, I think it largely played for laughs back in the early 90s, and I don't know that people find it as funny today. I mean, there are moments of comedy, but a lot of the hazing really looks a lot like abuse, I think, to modern viewers, and we might not find it as amusing. So, I find the tone and overall intention of the film to be a little bit hard to pin down at times, because it is worth pointing out that some of the most sadistic seniors, like O'Banion, who's played by Affleck, Darla, played by Parker Posey, who are really sort of leading the efforts to haze the freshmen, those characters are not viewed in a favorable light. I don't think we're invited to like those characters or to think they're cool. Like, O'Banion is very much coded as not cool, right? He's even kind of a joke to the other seniors, because I think he got held back or something just so he could go through the whole hazing thing again. Like, he's kind of viewed as a loser because he likes the hazing too much. Like, he derives too much satisfaction from it. He clearly has nothing else going on in his life. And then we can contrast his approach to the approach of Pink, who kind of goes along with it because his buddies do it and it's tradition. But we see when he kind of protects Mitch and goes easy on Mitch after the baseball game, like, it's not that important to Pink. Like, he's not a sadist. Like, he's not looking to inflict pain. He doesn't really derive that much pleasure from it. Once it stops being fun, he kind of loses interest, and he's really not out to hurt anybody. So again, that's kind of an important distinction to notice between the characters. That sort of signals to us that Pink's an okay guy, and O'Banion is really not. And then when we see O'Banion get, humiliated, outside of the hangout spot, that's sort of like a catharsis, really, for the audience and for the freshmen. We can all sort of feel this sense of relief that he got what he was coming. But yeah, there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of sort of casual cruelty. But again, in the midst of that, we can see that Pink's kind of cooler than that. Like, Pink's kind of above it. He's mostly a good-natured guy. And we also notice that even though he's a big-time football player, and obviously he hangs out with other football players, he also has other circles of friends. This might seem kind of banal and trivial, but it's important to Linklater. I don't know if it's important to you guys, but if you watch Everybody Wants Some, he explores this idea as well, because again, Linklater was a jock with like artistic sensibilities, right? He was like the jock who wrote, short stories, after practice or whatever. So he wants to capture that sort of in-between worlds experience that I think he kind of had, and we see Pink kind of experience it too, because Pink is cool with everybody, right? Not just the jocks. He hangs out with the stoners as well, represented by Slater and Pickford. Those are kind of the consummate stoner characters, although virtually everybody is smoking marijuana at some point. But he's also cool with like the nerdy kids, and even the freshman crew, led by Mitch. He ends up being pretty cool with them as well. So at least as far as he's concerned, there's a lot of cross-pollination. He doesn't mind hanging out with non-jocks. He's not a snob, right? He doesn't really buy into all of these social hierarchies that are obviously very important in high school life. And, I haven't been in high school for a while, so people younger than me can sort of determine if some of those social hierarchies have gone away. Do they still exist? Are they different now? We can track some of those changes. So he has a big group of friends, and then there's even some guys he knows like Wooderson or Clint, who we meet later at the party, who don't even seem to be in high school anymore. So they're not all necessarily still in school. Like somebody like Wooderson used to go to high school there, and he's just kind of hanging out, still living in the same town, still going to high school parties. So again, the way we perceive some of these individual characters, like Wooderson, even though he's not one of the main characters, I think that will go a long way towards determining if we think these characters are cool, if we think the actions being depicted are cool. Like, what do we think about Wooderson? Somebody who's, he's funny and like he seems like kind of a fun guy, but we also know that he's no longer in high school, still hangs out with high school kids, and particularly likes to pick up high school girls. He finds that to be fun sport. So, like, what do we make of a character like that? Some people think he's fun and cool. Other people think he is sad and pathetic. So where you come down in that determination might, go a long way, like I said, towards determining kind of how you view this larger cast. But of course, they're not all the same. And somebody like Mitch, he's so young, he's still kind of figuring it out, trying to find out who he wants to be. And that's largely what films like this, coming of age films, or if you want to call them teen films, they often explore that quest for identity, right? How do you make one for yourself, or how do you fit into existing archetypes? So all of the characters seem to be navigating that, to some extent or another. So again, I've mentioned the big cast, emphasis on dialogue. A big influence on Linklater was a film called American Graffiti. Some of you might be familiar with that, directed by George Lucas, pre-Star Wars. That film came out exactly 20 years before Dazed and Confused, but it was also, a movie representing teen culture. But American Graffiti came out in 73, but it was set in the 60s and really depicted the coming of age of boomers. So like the characters in American Graffiti are like the exact same age as my parents, going to sock hops and drag racing their cars in the 60s. Like, that was similar to, my parents' generation. So, but again, very just a movie focused on teens and what they did, their everyday lives, their relationships, their heartaches, their quest to be cool. So similar in terms of structure and the kinds of focus on teen life, which again is very common to us now. But it was a little bit less common in previous decades to think that teens were important enough and had interesting enough preoccupations to kind of center an entire film around them. Now, a lot of entertainment is like that. But again, films like American Graffiti and this one helped to make that the norm. And also the work of John Hughes in the 80s. I would repeat his name because he's a part of that movement too, making movies that almost completely exist. The entire filmic universe is really teens. We don't see a lot of parents. We don't see a lot of adults really. This is a teen world occupied almost entirely by teens. Okay, but yeah, think about the hazing. Like, how does that play today? How do we view a lot of these characters, the social hierarchies? And again, this emphasis on the mundane, the everyday, that might seem very typical now, but it was another thing that was kind of thought of as characteristic of Gen X art and Gen X filmmakers, because Gen X didn't have wars and social revolutions like the baby boomers had. So there was an increased focus on sort of everyday life. And again, we still have that even though we live in very different times today. But again, that was kind of part of this focus on suburban life. Suburban life is kind of mundane. It's quiet. Not a lot is supposed to happen there. A lot of people move to the suburbs to get away from cities or to find more opportunities than small towns. But these were supposed to be quiet, safe, stable places. So that's great for parents, often boring for kids. So again, that's all part of like Linklater's Gen X sort of reputation and his ability to portray suburban life. You could also think about the party at the Moon Tower. Often when people think about this movie, they really just think about that party sequence. It's very iconic. A lot of people think that's the entire film, but really that's just the final like 20 minutes or so of runtime. But we get a lot of other hallmarks of 70s teen culture before the party. We get the pool hall, we get the drive-in, the beer bust, and just driving. A lot of driving. And this is how it's, again, similar to American Graffiti, because the boomers, like my parents, were thought of as the first generation who really had the car as like a central part of their youth experience. And increasingly, as America became more suburban and more and more people left big cities or rural environments, you had more of an emphasis on driving. Because you guys know, if you've ever been to a big suburban neighborhood or a place like Huntsville, Texas, these places are made for driving. Right? It's not like a big city where there's lots of public transportation. And it's not like a farm or a small town where maybe you don't have to go far. In a suburb or sort of a mid-sized town, you have to drive. Like, it's hard to get anywhere if you don't have a car. So often we're just watching these teen characters driving. Sometimes they don't even seem to have a clear destination. They are just driving. Being in the car was a big deal. Part of that was based on suburban growth and like the actual mechanics and infrastructure like of suburban communities. But I'm not a city planner, so I can't talk much about that. But it increasingly like the car just becomes like a central part of teen life. That was true for millennials, certainly by the time I came along. But the car, it's an important symbol. It represents freedom. It represents a private place where you are away from school, away from your parents. You can do what you want. It's a good place to sneak alcohol and smoke pot and to get into other mischief. So the car matters. Driving matters. It's not just a sort of coincidental byproduct of the plot. Driving matters for these teens and for all the teens that came after them, I would argue, as well. Or at least most teens, the majority. And once again, I want to come back to Pearson and just wrap up by reading a little bit more from the slacking off chapter. This is at the very end when he's actually discussing Dazed and Confused. Interesting way of describing it. And I just want to kind of wrap up with this. But he's talking about something I've already mentioned, which is Linklater's ability to kind of combine certain art house indie sensibilities with a more commercial streak. And again, Dazed and Confused really showed his ability to do that. So Pearson says, on the one hand, Rick, he refers to him quite obnoxiously as Rick. On the one hand, Rick reached out to meet the mainstream audience halfway with a teen genre comedy. Again, talking about Dazed and Confused now. So he calls it a teen genre comedy. And he's making it out like Linklater does, makes this movie, at least in part, to reach a wider, more mainstream audience. But he says at the same time, Dazed has a certain number of wrinkles, many of which stem from his art film brat background, Linklater's art film brat background and personality. So I'm reading this all out of sequence. But anyway, on one hand, Rick is doing some mainstream conventional stuff with the teen comedy. On the other hand, like Slacker, his second feature, Dazed and Confused, had multiple plots, 78 characters, and an open ending without any particular lesson being learned. Now, do we agree about that? Do we agree with him about that? Is there no lesson to be learned, particularly for Mitch? Because it seems like Mitch is the one who's maybe doing the most growing and developing, but also Pink. Does Pink learn a lesson? Pink is also growing and developing. So again, Pearson mentions that the two of them, they sort of make for what he calls a double surrogate for Linklater, because Pink is like the jock side of Linklater, sort of the tortured, sensitive jock. And then Mitch is just kind of more based on Linklater's actual age and the time that Linklater would have been starting high school. So that's fine. But yeah, do you agree with Pearson's assessment? Does this strike us as a teen comedy? Do we think it really does have that kind of mainstream appeal? I mean, we know that it did, but can we recognize that mainstream appeal? How does it seem like a mainstream film while also being sort of a cult classic? Because like I said, and Pearson mentions this at the very end, it didn't make a lot of money in theaters, but found a huge audience later on home video. So he mentions a little bit about the production, so I'll end with this. Pearson mentions Gramercy's half-assed release of Dazed and Confused. So he's referring to Gramercy Pictures, which is a production company. That's the production company that financed the film. Gramercy started out actually as a joint venture between Polygram Entertainment, which is a British film studio, and Universal, which is one of those old school Hollywood studios left over from the Golden Age. So those two studios got together and created Gramercy, which, like I've mentioned, is one of these mini sort of like art house divisions of a larger studio that would mostly specialize in indie films. Right, or films that had that kind of indie sensibility. So ultimately, Gramercy becomes Universal's art house division. But according to Pearson, Gramercy did not do a very good job of promoting the film. So while it did get a big theatrical release, it didn't make much money, at least not relative to its budget. So that's what producers and other investors always care about. It's like, how much of a return are we going to get on the investment. So a film like this, which cost $6.9 million to make, it only makes $8 million at the box office. It only grosses a little over $8 million. That's not a big return. So it was viewed as kind of a box office disappointment based on its relatively large budget, at least for an indie type film. But though it was disappointing in theaters, it found a big audience on home video. So it's sometimes called a cult classic. Again, it was very popular with teenagers, high schoolers, college-age kids, and also older people who could maybe remember the 70s, or, they could remember some of these previous eras and these previous incarnations of teen culture. And then the final thought, the soundtrack. We can't forget about music. A lot of you have talked about music. The soundtrack really matters here. It was a big part of what made people like the film. It was a big part of its sort of crossover success. And the soundtrack itself became quite popular. I think it was pretty high on the charts. It features a lot of classic rock bands from the 70s like Aerosmith, Kiss, Deep Purple, Joan Jett, and of course Foghat does the song Slow Ride, which we see over that final credit sequence, which has become famous just in its own right. And you might notice a lot of films rip it off. A lot of films love to have a final credit sequence where we see all the actors and their names while some fun song plays in the background. Linklater helped to really popularize that particular technique as well. Okay, so that's it. I'm sorry this lecture was very long. I didn't expect it to be, but I guess I had a lot to say. So watch this I hope you broke it up into segments. Next week, we will get into Pulp Fiction.